What's going on? Welcome back to the show. It's well, I don't even know. It's our second, third, fourth time. Let's welcome you here. We'll do a super quick intro. And I know we were both kind of looking at the notes for today. And we're like, shit, man. Like, I don't know if we have enough time for this. So let's keep the intro short. I'll direct people to some other podcasts that they want to learn more about you.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. So, quick intro, Adrian Chavez. If you haven't heard me on previous podcasts, I have a PhD in nutrition, health promotion. And as we'll talk about today, I do a lot of debunking of misinformation online because there's so much of it, and it's just not based in science. So we'll talk about why a lot of that with respect to the gut today, and you'll hear more about that. And definitely check out the previous episodes where we talked about seed oils and insulin resistance, two other really interesting topics.
Yeah, definitely two of my favorite episodes. I know they've also just like done well metric wise, and I'm glad, frankly, because I think that they're just really chock full of high quality information in a topic that is chock full of misinformation. So I think we do a good job. Hopefully we're doing another service here today with this one, but to set the scene just for you guys listening, the kind of topics that we'll dive into. And just as I'm saying these, I know that each one of these could be an individual topic, but we're going to talk about gut health, obviously. And we're going to do a little bit of like, what is it? And obviously that by itself could be its own podcast. We'll talk about how much we really do know about it. Like, what are the things we do know? And equally, we'll talk about, well, probably not equally, we'll talk about all the things we don't know about it and some of the pseudoscience, some of what people are selling and saying that really isn't based in evidence, not based in things that we actually know, like what to look for as a consumer. Talk about fiber, fermented foods, probiotics, elimination diets, and a little bit about what Dr. Adrian's process might be if he has a client that comes to him with, quote, gut issues. I don't know how much of that we'll get through today. I'll try and keep us moving. If we get sidetracked on one of these topics, that's awesome too, and totally cool. I know there's plenty to talk about. So I'm going to throw it to you. Let's set the scene a little bit. Someone's like, hey, what is the gut, and how does taking care of it affect our health positively and negatively?
Yeah,
Super
so
broad,
the gut is a really long tract. It goes from your mouth to your anus. It's like 27 feet, varies from person to person. And there's different compartments to our GI tract. So when I think of the gut, when you say gut, I always think GI tract, gastrointestinal tract, where we're looking at the stomach, which is the first place where, well, food will start to get digested in your mouth, but then it goes down to the stomach, goes through the esophagus to the stomach. There's a whole bunch of acid in the stomach. There's an enzyme called pepsin. The stomach has really strong muscular contractions where it kind of moves your food around and makes it into what's called chyme. It's just this nasty ball of substance. And then it gets dumped into the small intestine, where your food then gets mixed with enzymes that come from the pancreas, from bile that's going to be released from the gallbladder. And all of these different organs are playing a role in your digestion. So when we talk about like gut health, we're usually talking about digestive health. We're usually talking about the totality of all of these different organ systems and how they work together. So in the small intestine, you're going to have that chyme. It's all the digested food. And then you're going to have enzymes from the gallbladder. Or from the pancreas, you're going to have bile from the gallbladder. And all of that is going to work to chemically break down your food so that you can absorb it. And in the small intestine is where you absorb those nutrients that you can utilize. And then your food gets pushed to the small intestine, to the colon, where there's a lot of microbes. So in the colon is where microbial digestion occurs more so than in the small intestine. For some people, it happens more in the small intestine for reasons that for reasons that actually can cause symptoms and aren't necessarily ideal, and it's not supposed to be happening in that way. But so after we digest our food gets sent to the large intestine. We have a bunch of microbes in there. It's one of the most microbial rich, places in the world, essentially, is in our colon. And those microbes are basically eating up what we don't digest. They're breaking down certain particles of different foods and utilizing some of that. And in many cases, promoting positive health benefits from the action that they're from the fermentation and other breakdown that is occurring of our undigested food. So that's the gut, how it affects our health in many ways. I mean, it can impact our ability to absorb different nutrients. So if you're not absorbing nutrients properly, that can impact your health in a number of different ways. So that's an important factor. There can be inflammation that's coming from your digestive tract could be the result of different food sensitivities, food allergies, microbial fermentation, and you have like dysbiosis, which means like you have a overgrowth of pathogenic types of microbes, and when you eat certain foods, it's aggravating that a little bit, creating an inflammatory response from that. So our digestive system is an intricate part of our overall health, and I don't think it's been recognized as such. And I think that's why, we've kind of seen the swing in the other direction, where a lot of people were talking about gut health, because I don't think, previous to 15, 20 years ago, even from a scientific perspective, we didn't realize how important our digestive system is. We didn't realize how important all these microbes that live in our gut are, and we couldn't really measure them very well. We still can't. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But, the microbiome and the gut microbiome, immune health, interaction between all of those different things that we didn't know about that scientifically until about 15, 20 years ago is when we first started being able to measure that. So that is a new frontier and something we're learning about currently. But the gut is, this entire, spectrum of, or this entire interaction between all of these different organ systems, that the primary goal is to digest food and eliminate waste. So the gut also helps to kind of remove things in our food that we're not supposed to be absorbing, and also remove certain things from our body that come from our liver that are dumped into our digestive system through bile, like different hormones and extra cholesterol, and the digestive system helps to eliminate that waste as well.
I think one of the big, maybe it's because it's conceptually just like easy to break down and discuss and say, and is this discussion of like taking care of the gut microbiota in the colon. It's like feeding those bacteria and having a microbial diversity. And I think that you actually mentioned a couple of things, which I'm happy that you did, that it's more than that, but I feel like that is the hot topic right now of like, oh, I got to take care of my bacteria. I got to make sure I'm feeding them bacteria and populating them and having diversity. And it's interesting that you also brought up kind of what can happen earlier on in that process of like absorbing things that maybe you shouldn't in the small intestine and such. And so when we're looking at like an average person listening to this podcast, like, okay, like I get it. Like it's one, like we don't know a ton about it. We know that there's a large connection and interplay between taking care of this system as a whole and other parts of my health, both physical and potentially psychological and mental. What are some things that we know are good? And I put that in air quotes for those of you guys. Now, what are the things that we know are good for taking care of our gut? Or is it even not that simple, because we do have to take things down to like an individual case?
I mean, the thing that is universally shown to be quote unquote good for our gut is plant foods. Like that is, I think that's the easiest thing that I can just say. This is good for our gut. Like in every study, intervention trial, and long-term studies where they're looking at microbial diversity, they're looking at development of diverticulitis, inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome. It's, given that you're eating, a mostly whole food diet, including more plant foods seems to be incredibly important. And that is likely due to various factors, but the fiber is an important one, because fiber is what is providing fuel. And it's not necessarily just fiber. The whole fiber, and the fiber classifications are kind of outdated at this point in terms of what these various non-digestible carbohydrates do. So we're looking at, it's not necessarily just fiber, it's carbohydrates that we don't digest, that when we don't digest them, they then get broken down by microbes in our colon, and that's what leads to helping to populate our microbial diversity and helping to improve our microbiome, if you will. But that, I think, is the one thing that I can say, like, without a doubt. Everything else is, could be good, could be bad, or not necessarily bad, but in every study, that's the one thing that's really consistent. If you're eating more plant foods, higher diversity of plant foods seems to be beneficial. And the thing with fiber that I really want to highlight that a lot of people don't understand is we kind of classify it as like insoluble or soluble. But the reality is every food has a different fiber structure, and that fiber structure can provide fuel for a different type of microbe. So that's why diversity is important, is because you're not getting just like soluble and insoluble fiber. There's such a variety of different types of fiber that can provide fuel for different types of microbes. And so if you're eating 5 different types of beans, and then a couple of different types of veggies with the meal, that's going to be much different than eating one bean, one veggie, even if it's the same volume. So diversity is important in our food for improving diversity in our microbiome. And this diversity factor seems to be the thing that's associated with lower rates of health conditions and better, improved metabolic health and other factors as well.
I definitely want to come back to the topic of diversity. I think that maybe that's just my inkling as to like where we're headed in terms of this discussion in fiber, in terms of the research and the recommendations. I think that's maybe you as a person more in the know have been more in the know about the importance of diversity, but I feel like it's coming more to the mainstream, or it's going to in the future. Let's take one small step back and just talk about how it is even the case that these non-digestible carbohydrates end up in the colon and what they're actually doing and how they get there. And then also maybe kind of break down some of the terminology that people have heard, like prebiotic fiber or probiotic or symbiotic. And what do these words even mean? How is it even that fiber is accomplishing this task of feeding the gut?
Yeah. So when I say undigested, that means all the enzymes that we have in our small intestine don't break them down. So because of that they move to the colon undigested. We don't absorb the sugars in those foods. And so rice is an example of this. If we heat rice up and then cool it down, it has more resistant starches. These aren't technically fibers, but they go undigested through the small intestine. When they get to the colon, the microbes in the colon break those carbohydrates down, use them for fuel, and that's what helps those bacteria and microbes to proliferate. So you mentioned prebiotics. So prebiotics are anything that provide fuel for microbes. So what I was just talking about, these undigested carbohydrates, these fermentable carbohydrates that we don't break down, that our microbes can, all of that is considered a prebiotic. So all of the foods that contain undigestible carbohydrates that are accessible for our microbiome, all of those would be classified as having some prebiotic. Oftentimes, we'll see prebiotics sold as supplements, and they'll include a lot of something like inulin or chicory root, and sometimes those are added to foods to increase the fiber content. That's not ideal because you're taking in a lot of one type of fiber, and unless that fiber is beneficial for some other reasons, like psyllium husk has many positive benefits that have been proven, like something like inulin or chicory root, those things often don't seem to be beneficial for many people and can cause GI symptoms for a lot of people. So I recommend staying away from like these prebiotic supplements and focusing more on prebiotic foods, high fiber foods, beans, nuts, seeds, whole grains, fruits and vegetables, and focusing there. So that's what prebiotics are. Probiotics are any live microbes that we're either consuming through a supplement or through our food. So we could get probiotics from yogurt if it's live active cultures. Same thing with sauerkraut and kimchi and things like that are fermented. But if it's not refrigerated, it's not going to have any probiotics. And the thing with probiotics is we're just guessing and we're hoping for the best. So like when you take in, let's say, kimchi, there's likely going to be some benefit. There's one study that has shown that eating, just going to the grocery store and picking up probiotic foods showed a benefit in terms of microbial diversity. And so it's probably a good idea to include some probiotic foods, but a lot of people expect them to do more than they're actually going to do, especially with the supplements. You're putting in like 10, 15 strains of some certain microbe, at maybe a couple million or tens of million or 100 million or maybe even up to a billion CFUs, which is colony forming units when you take in those pills or supplements or foods. But our GI tract has trillions of microbes, and we don't know how many of those microbes survive to the stomach acid, and many of them probably don't. So when we're taking in some of these foods, sometimes we expect it to have a larger effect than it actually is, because the GI tract is incredibly complicated, and the number of different species and the amount of microbes in our gut is substantially more than what you're going to get from eating some probiotic foods. So it may have benefits for some people, like taking in some of these things. Some people will notice like I'm a little bit less bloated or I'm having better bowel movements, but rarely do I see those type of benefits for people. And a lot of people are trying too hard to focus on these probiotics when the real benefit is from prebiotics. The real, thing that we've seen over the long term is just eating more fiber rich foods, because that's going to have additional benefits as well beyond just helping to populate your microbiome. The fiber rich foods are also going to have benefits for cardiovascular health and diabetes and other health outcomes as well. So that's what probiotics are. And then you mentioned postbiotics or synbiotics?
Symbiotic. We can do postbiotic as well. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Most people that haven't heard of the postbiotic one. Symbiotics are the combination of the two. So let's say you ate kimchi, that's a symbiotic essentially because it provides fiber and it provides microbes. So a symbiotic, when they do supplements, they're usually combining it with inulin, chicory root, fructooligosaccharides, some other type of prebiotic fiber within the pill, and then that's why they're calling it a symbiotic. I don't.
Is that relevant though? Is it like I understand, like, if a takeaway here was like, hey, prebiotics are things that feed my current microbiome and probiotics are things that populate my current microbiome with more bacteria, strains of bacteria, whatever. Like symbiotic is a word that means something that has both, but is that relevant that I must be that like I'm eating both of them at the same time and thus I'm getting more benefit, or is this a denomination here to like call something?
I've seen some clinical studies that have shown benefit, but they're comparing it to nothing. So they're looking at the symbiotic compared to nothing because they're just trying to show positive effects of it. I would say probably not if you're eating fiber in your diet and that's you're just taking a probiotic with your meal and you're actually eating a diverse, diet and you have different types of fiber. I'd say that's probably more beneficial than taking it in pill form. Plus, you have to take multiple pills, large pills, and you're getting ripped off when you buy that stuff anyway, because they're isolating a fiber source and charging you a high premium for it. So I definitely don't recommend that. I don't recommend the average person take probiotics. I mean, if you really want to, just eat some fermented foods and you're going to get both. Like I mentioned, the fermented foods are going to be a symbiotic anyway. So that's another one that it sounds cool when you hear symbiotic. It's like, oh wow, it's combining the best of everything that we need. But the reality is you're eating prebiotics if you're not like on a carnivore diet. So pretty much everyone is eating prebiotics in some way, and just taking the probiotic with that is going to be same thing. The other thing you mentioned, postbiotics. So postbiotics, this is a new field. I think there's going to be a clinical application to like for drug development with this field. Postbiotics are basically looking at all the different compounds that the microbes in our gut create and then trying to synthesize those. So for example, one of the things that some of the bifidobacteria in our colon create are what's called butyrate. And so butyrate, when it's a short chain fatty acid, when there's butyrate's a primary fuel source for the colon cells, and it also increases the release of an immune cell called interleukin-10, which basically turns down inflammation. So higher butyrate levels, if we can deliver it in the right way to those colonic cells, could potentially help with like inflammatory bowel disease. There's a little bit of research going on with that, but that's a postbiotic. That's basically taking something that was being produced by our gut microbiome and trying to deliver that in certain concentrations. And I think we'll be doing more of that from like a clinical standpoint, and more like drugs and potential. I don't think any supplements. I think there's going to be like some drug development from postbiotic, different postbiotic compounds, but trying to learn and understand postbiotics is just really, really complicated.
We're not there yet.
Yeah, and we can't control it. Like we have no idea what's going to be produced by what we don't get digested, because then, even it doesn't even come down to what we eat. It's like, okay, what we eat, but then do you digest it or do you not digest it? Does it get to does it get broken down by microbes in the small intestine first, or does it get to the colon? There's so many variables that go into whether or not, that end result is achieved in terms of having that positive effect on the compounds that are being created.
I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about net carbs, although I would hate for the motivation for people. I guess eating more fiber might be an end that's justifiable by any means, but this idea of net carbs, meaning, we just had this whole conversation about, okay, I eat certain prebiotic fiber, and the whole point is that I'm not digesting the entirety of this thing that I'm eating, assumedly not extracting all the calories from this food. Where do we stand right now on our understanding of net carbs and the application? Is there even a practical application of net carbs, or is it just something that most people should forget the existence of and kind of just find other motivation to pursue more diversity in terms of fiber and plant intake? Or is it something that's actually relevant and worth discussing?
Yeah, so yeah, we're not absorbing those carbs like we would traditionally with the normal carbohydrates. So we don't know how much energy we're getting from that at all. And that's the challenge. You can't just completely subtract that energy intake, because some of that is getting turned into short chain fatty acids, which provide a fuel source which can get absorbed into the system and contribute to energy balance. So and that varies dramatically based from person to person. So really just subtracting those calories doesn't make sense. I don't recommend it, because you're going to be underestimating. So just keep them in, and you're creating at least a couple of couple calories per gram from what I've read. So it's not, people are estimating that as 0 when it's actually probably 2 or 3 potentially. And so yeah, we definitely have to. I didn't know that term had blown up in that way. Like people were using net carbs to like eat more calories or whatever. But yeah, that's definitely not the way to do it. Eat fiber, yes, definitely. But using it because it doesn't provide calories is misinterpreted. We understand now. So we used to just know from a scientific perspective, we knew that it didn't get absorbed into the small intestine. So we just thought, okay, that's why they counted it as 0 calories, because that was the end of the understanding at that point. But now we understand that these fibers get fermented, and then some of them turn into energy still. So now that adds a layer of nuance to what we previously thought was, okay, if it's a fiber carb, it's 0. Because I used to think that as well, a decade ago. And then, I read some studies about like how some of these fibers get turned into fatty acids and by the microbes in the gut, and it's just unpredictable. So yeah, from that standpoint, definitely don't subtract calories from net carbs.
I think in a world where we categorically across the board underestimate our intake, this might just be one thing just that you should just fucking leave alone. And if you're happen to be overestimating by, a smidge, that like maybe this is like just one part of that scale that we can live with, because 9 times out of 10 we're underestimating across the board. So this might be just one thing that we just leave alone. And it definitely, like you said, definitely is going to depend on the individual. It's going to depend on the food. And so it might be just such a high level of variability that maybe we're not, maybe it's probably just best to leave it alone.
Yeah, definitely leave it alone. And like you said, typically when I'm recommending tracking, I'm typically recommending things that are going to get people to overestimate, because I know that you're probably underestimating 20%. So if we don't make up for that somehow, and some don't. There's the rare client who just truly tracks everything, but that is not the norm. Most people, even myself, even myself, I know that I underestimate when I do certain, or like if I am tracking, and I haven't done that in quite a while, but so I would just like purposefully overestimate certain things because I know that I'm underestimating certain things, and it evens out that way.
I'm less talking necessarily to the end consumer. I don't necessarily think that people are doing this calculation themselves. It's more so an issue of like FDA approving this on packaging. And so it's like, hey, I scanned a barcode for like my Mission Wraps, which we'll talk about in a bit. These, like you had mentioned, certain either supplements or foods that have been almost like injected with, I don't want to say fake fiber, but a high concentration of one fiber that might be just a misallocation of the benefit here. But yeah, it's like all of a sudden they're like, great, this wrap is 6 calories now, total after subtracting all the grams of fiber I don't absorb. So we'll get to that in a bit. I want to make sure that we're staying on track. We're going to get all of it. Let's do a quick little note on resistant starch. You had mentioned the idea of like, hey, if I cook rice and then I let it cool, it will then have a higher fiber content, that you might rephrase that more appropriately through an increase in what's called resistant starch, which is something that is not digested by the small intestine, let's say, that does make it, further along the GI tract. How important is that? How much do people need to be thinking about that? Do people need to just go ahead and stop eating their rice right away? Do we need to all start doing this? Is it something with a low risk, low reward, high risk, high reward? How are we kind of framing that?
So, I recommend just cooking starches ahead of time and, having them. No, so it's not a big deal if you eat it the first day, but it's going to increase the blood sugar response, or it's going to reduce the blood sugar response. It's going to turn into basically a higher fiber food. So everyone thinks, oh yeah, rice is a low fiber food. If you cool it, then it becomes a higher fiber food because some of these starches, the chemical makeup of that starch changes where it's no longer accessible to our digestive enzymes, and it can't be broken down in the small intestine. So it leads to this bacterial fermentation that seems to be beneficial, especially with these resistant starches. They seem to, all the studies that have been done, clinical randomized trials, epidemiological studies on resistant starches and consuming them show positive benefits. So rice, oatmeal, potatoes will do this as well. So kind of cooking, and even like pasta, cooking foods ahead of time, those foods ahead of time and letting them cool is definitely worthwhile. I wouldn't go like completely out of your way. And if you're like cooking dinner and you're like, no, I'm not going to eat it yet, I'm going to go put it in the freezer for an hour. Like, definitely don't do that. But it's convenient to cook stuff ahead of time anyway, especially with these starches where you can just put like a bunch of rice in the rice cooker. And then that is, number one, convenient for you. And then also, provides that additional health benefit when you do that. So I highly recommend doing that with those types of foods. You can also get resistant starches from beans and lentils. So I recommend eating those all the time anyway. So including more of those and replacing, one of the things that I think a lot of people could benefit from is like replacing some of the animal protein that they're eating with more beans, lentils, because those foods are going to provide some protein with fiber, with some B vitamins and micronutrients as well. Many different beans have good sources of iron, calcium. So that's a good strategy, and that's a way to increase resistant starches as well. It's just kind of include some more beans and lentils. But definitely, as you mentioned, I wouldn't go completely out of your way, but if you can prep some carbohydrates ahead of time and have those ready for the week, it's convenient for you, and it also provides some additional health benefit there.
Yeah, I think it's just another notch on the belt of like, hey, maybe doing a little bit of prep has an extra benefit here. Agreed. Let's you briefly touched upon it, this idea of maybe insoluble, soluble being kind of an outdated denomination here, an outdated difference, an outdated way of thinking about fiber, and that maybe we should be viewing these things as like fiber, like broccoli fiber or psyllium husk fiber or XYZ fiber, and more on an individual food basis, just because it's slightly more complex than like, oh, it has this much insoluble and this much soluble. Can we talk about this idea of maybe describing it in a different way and pursuing some form of diversity? And then we'll talk a little bit about general recommendations in terms of diversity. And then I would like to talk about like, is there like, going down the chain of like, okay, maybe talking about like total gram per day recommendations, or even where to begin with some of those things. So let's start with diversity. I know it's a lot.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing with the classification, so insoluble versus soluble fiber, this was just the way that it was first classified based on its ability to dissolve in water. So this was years and years and years ago. I think this classification was created 40, 50, 60 years ago. Now we understand that there's different properties of fiber. And as you mentioned, each food has different fiber types, so that, we think that the classification should go all the way down to the specific food and what the effects are of that food. But there's another set of classifications that has kind of been proposed recently based on like the actions of the specific fiber. So they also like to add to the insoluble soluble. They've also classified more recently as viscous and non-viscous fibers. So viscous fibers are the types of fibers that can form a gel-like substance in your intestines. And this gel-like substance is what absorbs some bile. This is what helps to slow blood sugar uptake and helps to regulate blood sugar control. So these viscous fibers, when we look at, fibers that are more viscous versus non-viscous, fibers that are more viscous seem to be more beneficial overall. So this is another form of classification that kind of helps us identify, okay, is this fiber more viscous? Is it going to have these beneficial effects on blood sugar, on cholesterol? And then the additional classification is fermentable and non-fermentable. And this is also a spectrum. So is with the viscous and non-viscous. Like, it's not black and white. Every type of fiber source has a certain potential to create that gel-like substance. And then also, and then there's also another classification within that, but we won't go into that. And then there's also the fermentable, non-fermentable, which is based on that fiber's ability to be fermented by gut microbiota. So that classification helps us to better understand like the properties and function of different types of fiber right now. And that's, I think, what's being used more commonly in the scientific community, and will be used more commonly like in public communication probably in the next 10 to 15 years. It's probably going to take some time because papers have just been published more so on kind of defining those specific criteria. But that's a good one because it helps understand, okay, this type of fiber is going to produce this like soluble type of effect that seems to be beneficial for all these things. And then, whether or not something's going to be fermented or not can help guide people in choosing the right fiber sources. The challenge with all of this is every food is going to have some degree of fermentability, some degree of being able to produce like that viscosity. And so this is where we really need to get to the point. We haven't really got there yet because we haven't been able to classify everything in this way, but where we can say, okay, broccoli fiber has this level of viscosity, this level of fermentability. And I think that'll be the next wave of classification, but that's going to be like another 10 years again, because science of really kind of classifying all of these things, now that we understand it well enough to create these more detailed classifications, now it's a matter of testing all of these foods and coming up with the criteria for classifying something as viscous or non-viscous or fermentable, non-fermentable, looking at broccoli stems versus broccoli, the tips of broccoli. Yeah. Like there's so much detail that needs to be filled in to get to that next level of classification. It's really important though for a lot of people, especially people dealing with GI issues, is because the fermentable fibers can be problematic for a lot of people. Insoluble fibers can be problematic for some people. So really understanding those classifications and understanding how to choose foods that represent the fiber types that are going to be easiest for you to digest, because a lot of people with GI issues tend to just get rid of fiber because they feel better when they're not eating it, but it's typically certain types of fiber. Like some individuals it's insoluble fiber, some individuals it's the fermentable fibers. And if you can kind of choose fiber types that don't fit those criteria that are problematic for you, then you don't have to just avoid all fiber and all plants. You can still feel good without doing that.
I feel like we're maybe at a point where very generally we're looking at it as shit, man, we're still figuring this out. There's a lot of differences and it is down to the actual food itself, not necessarily like this food is this thing. This food is its own matrix of a couple different qualifications. And again, if you correct me if I'm wrong, but it probably ends with a general feeling of like for the average person who's not currently experiencing GI issues, and we could talk about that in a sec, but like, that person's takeaway should be like, well, maybe it's probably best to focus on getting a wide variety of foods, of plant foods, of different kinds of individual food fibers in my diet. And that's probably where I should place more of the emphasis instead of trying to be so specific about it. It's like at this stage, we might not be at a point where prescriptive on a population level, we can say anything other than diversity is probably a good idea.
Yep, exactly that. I mean, a diversity of plant fibers and, like you mentioned, if you have digestive issues, that's when it would be worthwhile to get a little bit more granular. But if you don't, just eating plenty of plant foods. And I know there's a trend away from plant foods, but there's no evidence to support why someone who doesn't have a digestive response to these plant foods, which I want to also say that some people do. There's some people that when they eat these various fibers, it doesn't do well for their GI tract, and they feel a lot better when they take a lot of these fiber-rich foods out. But for the average person consuming fiber, consuming more plant foods, the evidence that stacks up for those health behaviors is astronomical. I mean, there's paper after paper after paper on broccoli and positive health outcomes, on tomatoes, on pretty much every fruit and vegetable. And so avoiding those for reasons that aren't incredibly clear to you is not a good idea.
And while I can be sympathetic to the person who's like, hey, I went carnivore, for a very extreme example where I cut out all plant foods and I felt better. I can sympathize with that experience, but probably a bit of a short-sighted move, and probably not a net, like compared to the alternatives, probably not a net choice, which we'll get to in a second. I was thinking while you're talking that the way that maybe it's not exactly analogous, but I think it feels a little analogous to different sources of protein with different amino acid profiles, where we are learning more that's maybe more relevant than we thought, but at the same time, still not overriding the idea that probably getting a decent variety of protein sources with a variety of the essential amino acids is probably a good idea. And we do, while it is a fun discussion, I was listening to a podcast with Peter Attia and this other guy, and who's like, we had this like 3-hour podcast about the differences of amino acids and how he would really focus on, leucine, methionine, and I forgot what the other one was. And then, just like very intellectual, super mechanistic all the way down. And then at the end, his recommendations were like, yeah, that's cool and all, but like you can kill it with the aggregate. You can probably just like focus on getting enough enzyme diversity, like enough total enzyme diversity, and you can probably cover all those bases. And on some level, it feels a little bit like that, except for in the circumstance where you're talking about where people have a specific pathology or experiencing certain GI issues, so that we can take some of what we know and make not complete uneducated guesses. I'm guessing, when we'll talk a little bit about your process, if we get to that, where it's like, like you said, there are going to be some we understand more viscous and more fermentable that we at least can make an educated guess as far as like, hey, maybe we start with this because you're experiencing this. And maybe that's where they become slightly less analogous. But that is kind of, it struck me. It was like, hey, we can have this super intellectual discussion about differences in fermentability and these other qualifications, but you're probably good aiming at some form of a total amount, even generally, and some form of diversity, even generally.
Yeah, it doesn't get more complicated than that, So these conversations can be, really overwhelming and sometimes go over so many different topics. But typically, the general recommendations are always simple. If it's not simple, it's probably not a good piece of advice overall. Just like you said, a variety of different plant foods, making sure that you're getting enough fiber, and we can talk about that now if you want, like
I'd love to. Yeah, let's go into that.
So enough fiber. So general recommendations, and this is based on where from population level studies there seems to be like greatest benefit achieved, is about 14 grams per 2,000 calories consumed. So that, or for 1,000 calories consumed. For the average person, that's 28 grams of fiber. It's pretty easy to get. So getting more than that seems to be beneficial, but that seemed like that level is where you can gain most of the benefits in terms of cardiovascular risk reduction, in terms of reduction of colorectal cancer and other GI issues. And it's 28 grams per day, which is 7 grams, 8 grams per meal, not that difficult to get. So most people are getting significantly less than this. The average population, I think, is about 14 to 15 grams. And half of what the recommended amounts are. So most people, I think, can benefit from eating more fiber. Same thing with like protein. These are two just important nutrients that we think people are eating enough of, but the average person, when we look at the numbers, is falling short for sure.
I think I have used the 14 grams per 1,000 calorie metric many times, and it's striking me now as the question I would ask you is the calorie amount a proxy for body size, or is there actually a relationship between like the percentage of fiber intake per total energy intake? Or is it more a proxy for like, hey, the kind of average person who's eating, 3,000 calories is probably larger, and probably that larger person also needs, more fiber? Or is it an actual interplay in the calorie amount?
Yeah, I think it's more so to be appropriate for the calorie amount. So if you're eating more calories, you're eating more fiber, that means that the types of calories that you're eating probably haven't changed. If you eat more calories and the fiber hasn't increased, then you're
Gotcha. That also
adding
makes
in
sense.
foods that aren't, replacing. And so I think the 2,000 calories is just kind of, it's 28 grams per 2,000 calories is where like the studies have shown, and then now they just kind of project down and upwards depending on how much people's energy needs are to kind of make those estimates.
Is there a difference in distribution? I mean, if we're looking at an asymmetric distribution of like somebody eating most of that in one meal versus splitting it up over other meals, do we know if there is a benefit to distribution, more even distribution?
We don't. That would be, I don't think that definitely has been tested. That's an interesting question. I think the limitation there is that you really have to, like, you can develop GI issues if you're eating enough fiber in a meal. So there's like a self-limiting,
Yeah,
uh,
I agree with that.
and people aren't eating enough fiber to get there
Yeah,
anyway.
true.
15 in a meal isn't that hard, and that's what people are eating over
Per
the
day.
course of a day. Yeah, so I don't think people are eating enough fiber for that to be a real issue. But yeah, I do think that, you know, distributing it throughout the day is probably going to be ideal just to avoid GI issues. And like you mentioned with the like Mission tortillas that have like 12 or 20 grams of fiber, those things you just got to be careful, because if they don't cause GI issues for you, that's cool. But for a good portion of people, they're gonna cause bloating, gas, discomfort, and you don't want to do that every time you eat a tortilla.
Well, let's stick with that. Let's transition here. I wrote down a couple of things that people have mentioned to me, and they're like, "Hey, what do you think about this?" Because ironically, is I have maybe a high percentage of clients who track something on some spectrum, whether it could be as simple as like meals per day that have a palm-sized portion of protein. Like we're just having some form of thing that we are aiming for, and tracking fiber, or at least even maybe to the an extreme context to the gram, even for a short term to see where you're at, is inching up the list for me of like actual like meaningful importance, both from a health and potential for aiding in fat loss potentially, let's say. We'll talk about in a bit. And then I'll have somebody be like, we're aiming for this like 15 gram per 1,000 calorie. Maybe we're in that like 25 to 30 range total per day. And then someone's like, bam, I'm going to get fucking 20 of that from these 2 Mission Carb Wraps. And is that the same, Jordan? And it's almost like, I'm curious what your take on, is this the same or is this okay? My initial reaction is that it's suboptimal because it is in the very least all coming from one source. And we just had this whole spiel about how like diversity is quite important. And if you're aiming for 25 and you get 20 from this like one thing, and we could talk about even if that one thing is a quality source at all, the fact that it is all coming from one thing, you're only going to aim for 5 more grams of fiber across the day, which means probably not a whole lot of diversity from there on. Are you looking at this from a like, and I'll get there to you in a second, stop the ramble, but are you taking this package over and turning it over and being like, what is the fiber source in here? And I'm going to make a judgment call on that. Or am I even taking one step back and be like, man, you're getting all of your fiber from one day from this one thing, from one fiber source that isn't even a matrix in any way. It's like this one, it's inulin or oligosaccharide, or it's psyllium husk or whatever it is. How do we go about reconciling like this, like Smart Sweets or Mission Carb Wraps, or this? I just saw this thing's Olipop. It's like a soda or something, and I looked at the ingredients, and they did at me. Maybe it's just the marketing. They have
Chicory root, right?
Well, there's like quite a few actually, and to me that like clicked of like, okay, quite a few is already at least one small step in the right direction, where it's not like bam, there's 14 grams of fiber in this protein bar and they're all from inulin and you're gonna fucking shit your pants or have diarrhea or GI discomfort. And so like, how are we reconciling that? Are you taking that on a case by case basis? Or are you generally looking at these as like, hey, this is like a probably not great to be getting such a high percentage from this one thing that's been like injected with like almost exogenously in a sense, isn't a naturally occurring fiber? I'll let you take that.
I would In terms of tracking, I would almost not track that stuff and kind of like pull that fiber out. I mean, there like you said, there's benefit if there's going to be multiple different sources, but with these wraps and things, they're typically just putting in a bunch of inulin is typically what I've seen in other just single
Is
fiber sources.
is that individually inulin? Is that, are you looking at that in a negative light because it's one source, or specifically something about inulin?
Because it's one source, and inulin is likely to cause GI issues for a lot of people, and it's just because it's highly fermentable. So that I don't recommend going in that direction, and I would almost like exclude tracking these super fiber sources. And there's only really like those tortillas and a few of these other keto things. Like I definitely had some bread the other day. I was just curious. I think it had like 22 grams of fiber, something
Oh, they're all over the
ridiculous.
place, man. It's
Yeah,
crazy. It's in a
it was
lot of
one of
things. Yeah.
it was one of these keto bread. So like I would take that out of the tracking, and if someone is eating a bunch of those and still hitting fiber goals, they're probably going to be bloated from doing both. So that's something that I would, definitely take on a case by case basis, but I would discourage using those multiple times per day. Maybe, once per day, getting 10 or 20 grams, and then still getting your fiber on top of that. But definitely in terms of using, those type of sources multiple times per day, it's just going to lead to too much fiber consumption, it's just difficult from a GI perspective. Like eating too much fiber is going to oftentimes lead to discomfort, and I'd rather see someone get less fiber from a variety of sources than getting, 60 grams from bread and tortilla wraps. I'd rather see someone get 40 from a variety of sources.
Yeah, I think if you had a circumstance where someone's like, "Hey, dude, I'm eating these Mission wraps, but like I also eat a high diverse diet with, and I do get 50 grams, and I feel totally fine with no GI dis." I mean, like, okay, in that context, you're all right, cool. It's like part of a total habitual dietary intake that's actually working quite fine for you. It's just that's not normally what it is. It's normally like, hey, Dr. Adrian said I need to get 28 grams of fiber. Here, I'm all the way there, and then I'm done for the day. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
in that context, I would discourage it as well. Totally agree.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's cool. That's good. It's interesting that are there, looking at inulin is one that I've experienced myself in terms of this GI distress quite a bit. There was like a couple protein bars back in the day, just when this
Oh
like
yeah.
whole net carb thing was coming out. There was like pumped. I remember Quest was one of the first companies that was like pumping inulin into all their products. They were doing IMOs, like isomaltol
Yeah.
oligosaccharides. And are there like outside of, I think we've established that you're getting fucking ton of fiber from one source and one type of fiber, probably not the best plan, especially if it's in lieu of diversity elsewhere. But are there specific fiber types that like specific types of fiber that people should look out for? Or is it just basically this idea of like having a ton of just one thing in lieu of diversity, probably not a good play?
Yeah, I don't think there's hasn't been shown any like negative effects of taking these in small amounts. I mean, they're prebiotics. There's benefits to like fructooligosaccharides and other there's been positive trials that have been shown with these at smaller doses. But the thing is that they're being put into things at 10 grams, 20 grams, and that's where like you said, it's just a shitload of one fiber that can really be problematic for some people.
That's awesome. Super helpful. I know that's going to help a ton of people out there. I just think that there's a large audience of people that are, seeking out, pursuing increasing fiber. They know it's important. And here's a way that, I mean, it's just not, I understand where they're coming
If
from.
there's
Like,
a couple grams too, like if let's say you had a bar that had 2 grams of fiber and it was from inulin, that a little bit different than
agreed.
the 10, 20 grams. So that I wouldn't worry about it. It's just not something that I would just go out and seek as a fiber source.
Yeah. Are there, like if you look at the protein analogy where you're like looking at foods that have like a high protein per calorie ratio, potentially, if you're concerned with even generally just both of those, whether you're specifically tracking them or not, you're just like acknowledging that both of those are important. And you're like, okay, lean proteins tend to like reign supreme in that regard. Are there, yeah, I was going to say, are there specific foods that you're like, hey, this is a real easy way to get more fiber in? And this is something maybe most people haven't thought about. And the reason I'm asking you is because recently in the last year or so, started to eat more like chia seeds and more basil seeds. And it's it's really unbelievably easy to get some of those things into your diet. And actually, that again, from a diversity perspective, that I think is something that is people are not consuming a lot of. That is a low hanging fruit. Like, what are some of these like? And maybe there aren't any, and maybe it's just a diversity thing. It's like, hey, like diversify what your intake is.
Beans, nuts, and seeds are the three that I think people don't eat enough of, and those all have additional benefits as well. So like beans and lentils, peas, edamame, soybeans, those as well, or like all of those are great options. They're all going to be high in fiber, and then any type of nuts and seeds. There's going to be a decent amount of fiber in pretty much anything: peanut butter, almond butter, sunflower seeds, almonds, macadamia nuts. Like you can pretty much eat any nut or seed, and you're going to get those different types of fiber, but you're also going to get healthy fat sources. You're going to get vitamin E and other micronutrients depending on what nut or seed you're eating. Some of those are going to have high potassium levels, magnesium levels. Like nuts and seeds are pretty nutrient rich as well. So definitely recommend, those three as sources to include more of. Most people that I speak to aren't eating any of them, or eating very little of, like either, beans and lentils they're eating almost none of, or nuts and seeds are eating almost none of. So really including some of those things into the diet on a regular basis. And when I say including them, it doesn't mean you have to eat a whole bunch of them. You can add some beans to, let's say, for example, you're making taco ground beef, and you can just add a can of beans to that to increase the protein, increase the fiber, and increase the number of different types of fiber that you're eating.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about this experience of, well, let's close the box. I'm looking at the notes. Let's close the box on fermented foods here. If people are like, hey, I'm really like into my like sauerkraut and my kefir and my kimchi and my kombucha, and it's like, are we placing what's our like 1 or 2 sentence recommendation on how to go about conceptualizing whether or not these things are worth it?
I mean, if you like them, go for it. I wouldn't go out of your way to purposefully try to include a bunch of them. Yogurt's great, kefir is great, but other things are even difficult to access. Like for me, where I live, there's no fresh sauerkraut or kimchi, so I'm not going to go drive to like Whole Foods 30 minutes away to get that stuff. So I wouldn't, go out of your way. But if you like to eat these things, like if there was kimchi at my HEB, I would definitely include it in some of my meals. So definitely recommend including these fermented foods as you enjoy them, but don't overdo it in terms of thinking that they're going to like have some major gut health benefit. They're really not. Usually they're not going to produce any noticeable effect on your digestion. They're good foods to eat. It's just a nutrient dense food like anything else, just like blueberries are a nutrient dense food. These are other foods that can provide nutrition for you.
I was just thinking that there's just like a big fat confounding variable of a lot of these foods also have other benefits too. And it's like, if you're like, hey, I'm trying to increase my fiber intake, and I start eating, like I am obsessed lately just with I don't know why, but we started eating a lot of berries. I got away from like a large diverse vegetable intake for a small period of time, and got really just started eating a lot more like berries, let's say, and was getting expensive. And so somebody like posted on social media that they were just getting like this big bag of like frozen mixed berries, like not organic, just like way more cost effective. And it's just funny that like in the pursuit of increasing fiber, like there's just so many indirect benefits, knock on confounding benefits here of like ton of extra micronutrients or polyphenols or whatever else we talked about maybe potentially different protein amino acid profile from switching out to some adding some beans or whatever. And so it is interesting that there's like, in the pursuit of increasing fiber intake, a lot and increasing diversity, like a lot of good other things happen too.
Well, yeah, that's why it's a good recommendation. Like
yeah,
it's a good recommendation more so because I always talk about this. People are like, sometimes I feel like people question why I'm recommending fiber, and this is why. It's just it's a proxy measure for if you eat more fiber in diverse amounts of fiber, you're going to eat more fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, beans, whole grains, which is good. And so that's where I like that you mentioned you have people track fiber, because that can be really good for increasing the number of vegetables and fruits that they're eating without telling people to eat more fruits and vegetables, because people don't like to hear that as much.
Yeah, agreed. Let's talk about a little bit about I could talk a little bit. I just will explicitly mention the carnivore diet, but just generally, obviously, that's just like an extremely extreme, that's redundant form of an elimination diet. This idea of I stopped eating fiber and I felt better. How are we reconciling that situation? And usually, even more like an attempt to formulate that argument is the person saying, well, then I reintroduced my plant foods and started feeling worse again. So this is a very clean experiment of like felt better when I took them away, felt worse when I brought them in. How do we reconcile this person's experience?
Yeah, so when you take them away, when you take away plant foods, you're going to take away fermentation, the process of fermentation that's occurring in your gut. So if you're bloated, you're gassy, you take away plant foods. Number one, a lot of times people are taking away a lot of foods that they know they shouldn't have, like not shouldn't have, know that weren't nutritious in the first place. So understand where you're going from in your diet. Like if you're eating a bunch of processed foods and then you take away all these, quote unquote plant foods, you're taking away a bunch of processed foods that probably weren't good for you anyway. So that is not a clean swap in terms of, really looking at whether or not it's the plants that are causing this. Now, if you're eating a healthy diet already and you go from, okay, I take away plant foods, you feel better. That's likely the results of how those plant foods and plant fibers are interacting with your microbiome. And it could be in some cases that there's certain fibers that were contributing to that. It could be for a lot of people with inflammatory or irritable bowel syndrome, FODMAPs, certain types of fermentable carbohydrates, they can contribute to bloating and gas and discomfort. And so individuals, when they go on a low FODMAP diet, this is well tested. This is the standard of care essentially for an individual with IBS, is put them on a low FODMAP diet. When they go on that low FODMAP diet, 70% of people experience dramatic improvements in symptoms. And a lot of people, in my opinion, I've seen this, I've heard stories, a lot of people with IBS are going on these carnivore diets, and it's essentially a zero FODMAP diet. So they're taking away all of these FODMAP rich foods, and that leads to symptomatic improvement in the short term. Studies on low FODMAP diets have shown that when you restrict FODMAPs for a long period of time, there's negative effects on the microbiome. Seems to have negative effects, over the long term. And I'm seeing this. We don't have research on it, but I'm seeing this with people who are reaching out to me. And it doesn't happen all the time, but anytime I talk about the carnivore diet, people will reach out to me and say, hey, I've been following this diet for a while. I felt great at first, but now it's a year later and, my GI tract is messed up. Or I started developing all these other issues. My testosterone's down, cholesterol is completely out of control, whatever the case may be. So, a lot of people are going to feel better. IBS affects 15% of the population.
At least in the short term.
Yeah, a lot of people are going to feel better in the short term from a digestive standpoint. Some people feel better from a energy and health standpoint, number one, because you're losing a lot of weight oftentimes. Number two, you're eating more protein, which a lot of times people just aren't eating enough protein anyway. And, number three, you're going into ketosis. So for some people, that's going to feel better from an energy standpoint. It's going to feel better than, what you were eating before if you weren't fueling yourself properly before and you were eating junk food and eating massive meals and going hours without eating, not just like fueling yourself properly. So, there's many different factors that can be at play here. And I've heard many stories, and usually they fall into one of these categories of like you were just going from junk food to eating healthier, you had existing digestive issues, and you needed to do an elimination diet. And it happened that you stumbled upon carnivore, and this turned into your elimination diet, but it wasn't necessarily, you don't have to really remove all of those foods. It could have been that you just stay away from certain types of fibers, certain types of carbohydrates, and you would have experienced that same symptomatic improvement without the potential side effects of going on this type of diet long term.
What's the order of operations there? Is it symptom based? Are you making educated decisions based on client feedback or educated I say educated guesses just based on the fact that like it's not a surefire thing. It's like, oh, you're bloating, bam, it's FODMAPs. I mean, that, so like you said, 70% see at least an initial like great reduction in symptoms. But what's that process like? Is it client feedback driven? Is it evidence based from research driven? Is it a combination of those things?
Definitely a combination of those things. So symptom based on I have clients do a food journal. We're looking at, okay, how often are you getting bloated? How severe is it? What foods were you eating? We're simplifying their nutrition. That's the most important thing. You have to simplify your nutrition for a period of time and then test out various foods, because that will help you dial in on the foods that you're actually reacting to. But a lot of people in the and this goes against the diversity thing. So this goes against what we've been talking about the whole time. And this is where, nuance in nutrition has to exist, because there's always, exceptions to everything. So like when you have digestive issues, eating 12 different vegetables in a meal and a couple of different beans or whatever, yeah, that might be great for promoting diversity long term, but it's not helping you to dial in on the certain things that you're reacting to. So I always have people simplify their nutrition. We try to identify based on history, what are the main triggers of your GI symptoms. For some people, it's high fat meals. For other people, it's FODMAPs. For other people, there's just different things. It's just certain types of foods, certain types of FODMAPs. So, taking away as little as possible at first, and then seeing the symptomatic changes, and then, kind of following an order of operations of, okay, this is the lowest hanging fruit. This seems to be most likely to be triggering symptoms. Let's take that away, see how you do. Give it, a couple days, and then make some decisions about, next steps on removing additional foods. But I always recommend, depending on the severity, if someone's really uncomfortable, they're having like, just can't deal with it on a day-to-day basis. In those cases, I might recommend, hey, let's take away all these things, and we'll add things back later, just to try to get symptomatic improvement as quickly as possible. But depending on the severity, either take away a lot to get quick symptomatic improvement, or take away the lowest hanging fruit and try to work through that process. And then the goal is to just dial in on the specific things that someone's reacting to, and oftentimes that gives information about what's going on. So if someone's reacting to, and a lot of times what I'll find is that someone's reacting to FODMAPs, but they're only reacting to FODMAPs when they're constipated. And so if you fix the constipation in there, they become more regular, like that's not an issue. So there's a lot of considerations that are taken into account, and it's all based on feedback, as you mentioned, and really taking into account the evidence, all of the studies that I've read on this topic, and IBS and different approaches to it. And then, taking that feedback, and the feedback ends up being, the most important thing. And as you mentioned, it's just educated guesses. Like with GI stuff, anyone who promises more than educated guesses is misleading you. And I always tell anyone who reaches out to me to work with me, I'm like, this is what I think might work, but I have no idea, or I can't promise anything, or in many cases, I've seen certain things multiple times and have helped people to improve those certain issues. IBS-C is one that I've helped a lot of people with. So I know that with that, I can usually get down to the underlying factors and really help people improve their symptoms. But like you said, it's a whole guessing game, and it's educated guesses, and
what
going
screams
based on feedback.
What it screams to me as somebody who's like also works with people in this context of their nutrition is that if you're having GI discomfort that you think requires, or you're kind of have this gut feeling, pun intended, that you should kind of think about, okay, maybe I'm having a reaction to certain things. The minute you're like thinking about doing something like an elimination or trying to go down this path of figuring it out, what's going on, please work with a professional. This is just not something that like I feel qualified doing. This is not something that the average coach should be walking their clients through, in my opinion. It just feels like even the professionals who like yourself, who are just very much immersed in this and know how to take the feedback, you're still making educated guesses. What the hell am I doing? And so yeah. I definitely feel like this is like, I have a friend of mine who at some point I was like, dude, like I want to help, and I have some loose knowledge from like talking to professionals, and just there's just a line in the sand of like seriousness to the point where it's like, this is something that should be taken seriously, and you should see a professional for this.
Yeah. I in the future, in the next couple of years, we should see more dietitians who specialize in this, and who can help individuals, and who get referred by their GI docs, because that would solve everything. If you went to your GI doc, you got diagnosed with IBS, and you got sent to a dietitian who just knew it and could really provide the proper guidance. But unfortunately, a lot of like local dietitians don't stay up to the research or don't stay up to date with research. So people get referred to a dietitian, or they don't get referred in most cases. But when they do get referred, half the time they're meeting with someone who's not up to date with the research and doesn't really provide the right guidance. And unfortunately, there's a lot of breaks in the process that where right now it should be, and this is the case in with some people that I've worked with, overseas, where as soon as they got diagnosed with digestive issues with IBS, they got referred to a dietitian who specialized in that. And we should be there with our healthcare system, but it's taken time for sure. But the evidence for the right approaches, for IBS are pretty solid in terms of the research. Like we know what works generally, and a skilled practitioner should be able to put that into practice with a patient, if they're staying up to date with that research.
It's just a conversation you and I have had several times. Like the presence of absolute language and just a high level of certainty around this, like, is just in some ways a red flag of like, I almost feel that same way sometimes about like I think physical therapists are great, but sometimes I think the pain, like trying to identify exact causes of pain, is also in this abstract educated guess context. And it screams to me like, and I want to transition to over some of the pseudoscience, and kind of ask you like, what makes this topic so ripe for misinformation and for charlatans and for marketing and for bullshit?
Yeah, it goes back to what we were just saying at the beginning of the episode. It's been about 15 years since we've been able to measure the microbiome. So been able to do these DNA-based tests where we're looking at the DNA of the microbes that come out in the stool. But we're looking at the DNA of the microbes that come out in the stool. We're not going in and measuring what's in the small intestine, at the proximal part of the small intestine, what's in the stomach, what's in the, the distal part of the large intestine, what's in different parts of small and large intestine. Like there's different environments throughout this 27 feet of GI tract, and there's different microbial populations, and each of these microbes could be contributing to various symptoms in ways that we don't understand at this point. So that's where, a lot of this stuff is ripe for misinformation, because experts are saying they don't understand. And if you have a GI issue, you're looking for someone who understands. So it's really easy. The first person who says, "Hey, I get it, I know how to fix you," they're going to develop a platform. Like if I went on and said, "I have the solution to IBS, follow me for the IBS solution," and I spoke about these topics, and I could in a way that seems very convincing, and I just oversold the actual potential of the things that I'm discussing, that would go viral. That would help, that would reach a lot of people. And that's where pseudoscience and these topics, where we don't really understand them that well, someone who lacks integrity is always willing to step in and pretend like they understand it better than they actually do. And at this point, we still can't measure the microbiome that well. We don't have long-term data on microbiome changes and how that impacts various health outcomes. So we don't know, like, okay, if you eat these foods, how does that affect your microbiome, and how does that in turn affect depression, anxiety, like all of these different things that we want to be able to talk about. And we know that there's an impact. We know that what's going on in our digestive tract is definitely impacting every health system throughout our body, our hormones, our mental health, our neurotransmitter production, because of the fact that it's involved in so many different processes. But characterizing all of that stuff is just not possible right now. And people saying, gut-brain interaction and things like that, that's generally based on very minimal data. That's based on data that shows, hey, people with IBS have higher rates of anxiety. And we don't even know which one came first. Like, is it the anxiety that caused the IBS? Oftentimes that's the case. But people will say, oh, look, another piece of evidence for gut-brain interaction. This is why you have to take care of your gut if you're anxious. And the reality is, oftentimes it's the other way around. It's the anxiety that causes the GI issues. And this is, the science is just so limited on this field. We don't, as I mentioned, like in terms of like gut brain, we don't have good intervention trials where we're feeding people foods or feeding them, microbes or probiotics and showing benefits. And there's probably a dozen studies that have looked at, depression, anxiety, when people take probiotics, but the results are so mixed because when you take a probiotic, like let's say I'm taking a probiotic and then Jordan, you're taking one, the effect that it's going to have on my ecology is going to be dramatically different than what happens in your gut because we have different microbes. And so even if let's say all those microbes got into your GI tract, how it interacts with the community of microbes that you have is going to be completely different than how it interacts with the community of microbes that I have. And so I don't think that microbiome based interventions are going to be something that we really use and see major benefit from until we can properly profile our microbiome in at all sites. So that's going to take like swallowing a capsule or something like that, and it just taking samples throughout our GI tract. I don't see any other way that that's going to occur because we'd have to stick a tube all the way down the 27 feet of GI tract. But that, we're going to need to know what our existing microbiome is, what it's lacking in terms of like the postbiotics that it's producing, and how we can, basically support that with a targeted microbial delivery, that's going to be some individualized probiotic. Like we'll be able to do that in the future, but right now it's a guessing game taking a probiotic or doing, and this is where people who come in and say, hey, I have the answer, here's this microbiome test, or here's this food sensitivity test, or here's this probiotic that everyone needs to take. It's attractive, it sounds nice, but it's never going to be something that really stands up to the claims that are being made around that.
Yeah, and when we're talking about this, like, you could go on your page and just purport a bit more of a I'm sure of this mentality, and to the average consumer, why choose uncertainty when you could choose certainty? Why choose the person who's not sure? Why not choose the person who's sure? And at first glance, I understand that, but I feel like I'd like to, as much as a lot of these health benefits or a lot of these like health discussions and nutrition discussions are cool, like one of the things I think would have would make a big difference is that just from a consumer standpoint, from an education of the consumer standpoint, to kind of maybe value the uncertainty a little bit more. Like I'm just like, just generally, you and I've talked about this before, but this, like, if you're seeing people who are, a bit more uncertain, but willing to learn and willing to change their mind, and hey, this is what we think we know based on this evidence, we should start to just kind of elevate that or seek that out more. Actually, the certainty should be more of a red flag. And then something I find hysterical is a lot of times headlines will read something to the effect of XYZ changed the microbiome with an exclamation point. And then, that sends like an emotional response into the reader. But at the end of the day, that's not an end like an end product. Like we're looking for, how does that change affect your end product? Something about actually how you're, some sort of phenotype, right? And so I always like laugh, like I'm not going to I don't want to go into the artificial sweetener research, but there's like always somebody's like, it affects the gut microbiome. I'm like, how does that affect your life and your day to day and anything about like your actual health? I mean, any change you make to a lot of factors, nutrition, there's a ton of them, will change your microbiome in some way. If you change something about your diet, changing your microbiome, like to me, that makes a ton of sense. But the word change doesn't necessarily tell us anything. And so I was just like, they're like, it affects the microbiome. I'm like, yes, how? And how does that change affect or manifest in some phenotype, in some expression of your health at the actual endpoint?
Health headlines are, I mean, there's a science behind it. They truly have studied this and studied how to market to people and get people to buy into these, claims. And so you just got to be careful with headlines. And this is why I recommend, I mean, I think really one of the best things that most people can do is just shut off like pretty much every source of information that you can in this space, except for a small few. Because if you listen to your friend or your coworker, or you let yourself slip into reading the headline on Prevention magazine, which seems legit on the grocery store checkout, you're gonna get these little messages that are just bullshit, like just complete bullshit, and you're trying to like figure out your health and what to do when you're just taking in all of these small bullshit messages that are just you're trying to make sense of them, and it's overwhelming, and goes back to what we said, if you're worried about your microbiome, just eat a diverse diet. Stress is probably a big factor there as well. Like stress is probably the second biggest factor besides like diet, and stress comes from exercise too. Like too much exercise, too little sleep, too much psychological stress. These are all probably three of the main factors that I see that kind of combine together to negatively impact people's digestive health. And so, food diversity, simple stuff, it is really where it's at. And with most things, I tell people this too, like, because people ask me about like, what do I need to do for brain health, or what do I need to do for X health? And we can't micromanage our organ systems. Like it's going to get really complicated living a healthy lifestyle if we think that we have to micromanage every organ system and keep every organ system at optimal health. If you're focusing on the big picture, you're focusing on really keeping yourself healthy overall and doing the things that we know are, quote unquote, health promoting, eating plenty of fruits and vegetables, eating plenty of protein, not overeating, exercising, managing stress, sleep. Like if you're doing those things, you're taking care of each organ system. Like you don't have to specifically do certain things for each one. I get these questions all the time, and I always think that I'm like, we really think like, oh, I have to do this for my gut health, and I have to do this for my kidneys, and I have to do this for my brain. And like that's just making it incredibly too complicated. Like just focus on healthy habits overall, and that's going to improve your health, and that's going to improve your gut health and every other organ system along with that.
I don't think we've had a podcast that hasn't ended exactly the same way. I don't think we've had a podcast where I've ended with like a really profound change, just like outside of the big rocks. But yeah, there of course there's some nuance within it. But yeah, I totally agree with that. Let's do a couple hot takes. I'll let you get out of here. We'll do a couple hot takes of just looking at things like IgG tests, like food sensitivity tests, like microbiome tests, like stool tests. Like are we on the scale of total bullshit, or on the scale of like probably not worth your money, but maybe one day we'll be there, or yay, these are great, it's going to totally fix you? Or where are we on some of those things?
Stool test. I mean, if you have unlimited money and you have the right person interpreting it for you, and it's just like you're looking at it as interesting as opposed to like, hey, this is a diagnostic test. Yeah, do that. IgG test, that's completely worthless. I think one day I was on a podcast yesterday talking about inflammation. I think one day we'll be able to like have people swallow like a protein of various types and see the response throughout the body that happens when it comes to inflammation. But IgG is not looking at inflammation. It's not looking at a negative response to food. It's really, that one's a complete scam. And so microbiome tests, one day those are going to be amazing. One day that's going to be really helpful when we are able to actually profile the microbiome. Right now, it's not a microbiome test, it's a stool test. It's looking at the microbes in your poop, not the microbes in your gut. So that's the important thing to differentiate here. And so when we actually can do a microbiome test, that's going to be great. Pretty much all food sensitivity tests are bogus at this point. I think technology is a ways away from being able to properly profile inflammatory responses to foods, because there's a potential inflammatory response in the gut. There's, in various tissues throughout the body, there's several different places where that particular food can be contributing to an inflammatory response, and we can't measure that right now. So that's something that these tests are claiming to look at the foods that cause inflammation for individuals, but it's not really there. And so I definitely recommend avoiding those of all types, especially like there's one that's like $600.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I forget that there's a I think it's functional diagnostic nutritionist. They use this test as a way to like personalize people's nutrition. So messed up. But definitely recommend avoiding all of those for now. Save your money on that stuff. Invest your money into learning more about nutrition, or having a coach, getting accountability support. Like,
or in the too many people section.
Too many people are wasting their money on gimmicks and testing and supplements, and not many people are investing into guidance, coaching. This professional guidance and coaching is so helpful for many people who have been dieting their whole lives. And I know that some people think, oh, that's what they do, so that's why they're promoting. Honestly, like I send people to other people most of the time, because it's like I can just see that you're going to benefit from just having someone to say, hey, chill out, focus on these things and do this, and let me show you how that gets results. And once you see the results, it's like, okay, now I can just keep going with it. And people don't realize the value of, 3 to 6 months of getting quality coaching with someone and how that can really uh, take away a lot of these uncertainties.
I'm gonna let you go here and we'll wrap it up. But I'm interested. I'm interested in the discussion of diversity as it evolves, and it's something that I will continue to disseminate down to my following and my clients as something that's independently important. I think that, again, from the protein analogy perspective, like, I do think that there's a value in pursuing total daily amount as a hope that it's a proxy for diversity, and independently also probably helpful outside of an extreme circumstance where you're just pounding Mission Wraps and that's it. And so I really look forward to that the progression of that discussion of the importance of diversity, and hopefully it makes its way down to the mainstream as something that's potentially equally as important, or slots itself into the hierarchy somewhere, in relation to the importance of total daily number. But it is becoming increasingly clear that diversity outside of the circumstance that we talked about, where maybe you have a specific GI issue that we're going to, from a more logical experimentation, like building a more structured experiment, we're going to break it down to like more simple, maybe less diversity to try and isolate a variable. Outside of that circumstance, I do find that interesting, and I hope there's more discussion about it, because it seems, just from the educators and experts like yourself and other people that I've been listening to lately have been emphasizing it quite a bit, and I just like I feel like it should be something that we're talking about more.
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree. And from another perspective, the micronutrient, the different micronutrients that you get from plant foods is also an important factor. So I've been preaching diversity since before we really understood these fiber sources. Because if you're taking in, for example, onions, and you're getting quercetin from that, and you're taking in tomatoes and getting in lycopene, and you're getting anthocyanins from berries, like these different micronutrients. When we isolate these things, when we take lycopene and mix it with different cancer cells, like these things have medicinal type benefits. So this is where I think consuming a variety of different plant foods of different color spectrums overall from a fiber perspective is good, but also from a micronutrient perspective, like the intake of different micronutrients that you're going to get exposed to that aren't necessarily recognized as like, essential vitamins and minerals, but also seem to be providing a health benefit as well. And this is where, a lot of these supplements come from, these plant compounds that we have shown to be beneficial in a lab. And, these companies just try to like create very, potent sources of them, but you can get this stuff through food. It's in smaller amounts, but there's likely a benefit from that. And I think that's why we see plant-based diets, people who eat more plants tend to do better overall, cancer, heart disease, and everything else, partly because of the fiber, partly because of these different micronutrients that come from these foods.
Yeah, I just will end on just like as we're talking about the importance of diversity, I do want to sympathize with the consumer who's like maybe feeling overwhelmed, like they have to live in a fucking garden. All of a sudden they got to like have 400 different plants every day and every week. And, I think just like everything else, it's about meeting you where you're at and moving in a directional sense towards a smidge more diversity over time, and maybe just shifting your mindset when you're in the supermarket. And I don't want to dive into a big how, even though I think that's a fair discussion. But if you are listening to us and you're like, oh my God, I can't have broccoli anymore. I like broccoli. I really got to have, a bunch of different stuff every day. Yeah. Okay. Doesn't need to be an overnight change to this like crazy.
The frozen blends are everything.
Yeah,
like you said,
simple things like that.
The frozen mixed berries, the frozen Normandy blend, the frozen, like that's how I get
mixed
most of
nuts,
my produce.
Mixed seeds, definitely. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's a really good point.
That helps to really increase diversity without having to really think about it much. Just buy a different type of frozen veggie and mix it into your meals.
I think most people, again, I think of myself, and I like, maybe I really enjoy maybe like at least 5 vegetables, but I might, just for the sake of like my brain being off, I might stick to one out of an assumption that it's just all the same shit anyway. And I think it'd be important to acknowledge that, like, okay, if you like all of these vegetables, maybe make an effort to rotate each of them in a bit more instead of just sticking with that one thing. But you're so right that a medley, a blend, they exist out there. You don't necessarily need to be creating them from yourself from scratch. You totally can, though.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool, man. I'll let you go. Tell people where they can find you and drop a line and we'll let you get out of here.
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram. It's probably the place where I'm most active. My handle is Dr. Adrian Chavez there. So at Dr. period Adrian period Chavez. And then also I just relaunched my own podcast, the Nutrition Science Podcast. So that is another great place to learn more on various topics. So I'm just launched the first episode. It'll be, by the time this comes out, I'm sure there'll be a few more.
Nice. Excellent. That's exciting, man. I'll give it a follow. All right. Thanks a lot for coming on, man. Excellent episode as always. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you.